Alright, so hello and welcome back. Today we're going to be reacting to the deadliest day of the Napoleonic Wars, which is going to be Borodino, animated history by the Armchair Historian. I'm going to leave their stuff in the description. I suggest you go give them a like. Their stuff is very good. So without further ado, let's get with it.
Nikolai Raevsky can barely see through his spyglass. From his position on the parapet of an earthen redoubt, the Russian struggles to pierce the thick smoke of his own cannons. Surely the French have been driven off by his artillery, and a second attack is out of the question. A staff officer interrupts his rumination with orders to shift position. Raevsky looks the dispatch over, questions of logistics and maneuver coming to mind. In the thick smoke of the cannons, a French infantryman struggles to breathe as he ascends the earthen side of the redoubt. He checks his bayonet to make sure it is locked securely in place, and not 10 feet away, through the thick, noxious smoke, he can hear Russian voices.
So the reason they're mentioning smoke a lot is because, one, black powder is very smoky, and you really can't see very well if you've been firing for a good any time. Actually, really, any few shots is going to get pretty bad, especially thousands of men and thousands of artillery shells. Yeah, you're not going to be able to see anything. Smokeless powder is different, but you know.
Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. In the early 19th century, the entirety of Europe seemed poised to bend the collective knee to a single Corsican, Napoleon Bonaparte. The Grande Armée enforced Bonaparte's will on most of mainland Europe, installing quislings and lesser Bonapartes and isolating the ever-defiant British, leaving the French with one true rival for supremacy on the continent, Tsarist Russia. Resolved to ensure his was the only power in Europe, Napoleon turned his mighty force east, invading Russia and signing the death warrant of his empire.
Yes, it was his death warrant. You could argue that Spain was one of them, and I would argue that Spain was a massive mistake, and he didn't have to do that. But that was like a half death blow, and then Russia was the full death blow.
In this video, we will look at the climactic Battle of Borodino, the last triumph before the French eagle came crashing to earth and was savaged beneath the claws of the Russian bear. During the Napoleonic Wars, all nations maintained extensive spy networks both at home and abroad. France, in particular, benefited from the services of men like Joseph Fouché, who conducted numerous missions to infiltrate foreign governments, assassinate prominent officials, and sow disinformation among the emperor's many enemies. Luckily for us, the sponsor of today's video, NordVPN, offers everyone the tools they need to keep their military secrets and diplomatic messages safe from prying eyes. In addition to offering threat protection against malware, generating secure passwords via NordPass, and providing encrypted cloud storage via NordLocker, NordVPN lets you access region-locked content from around the world. Even our team can benefit from NordVPN, letting us view historical movies, documentaries, and assets normally blocked outside their home countries. So head over to the description box and start protecting your data today, with 4 months for free off of a 2-year plan and a 30-day money-back guarantee when you start using NordVPN via our dedicated link, nordvpn.com/historyvpn. Napoleon led an army of 680,000 men, while the Russians called up 623,000 conscripts. Napoleon's force was a varied one, with units of cavalry and over 1,200 artillery pieces. A significant portion of Napoleon's numbers came from allied or vassal states, with half of his cavalry units and a third of his infantry coming from the German state of Württemberg, while the emperor himself led French and Italian troops.
Yeah, this is something that's not, I won't say it's not talked about, but if you look in Napoleonic history, the Grand Armée, especially by Russia, was made up of by a bunch of allied states. Württemberg is the black and red one, by the way, obviously, and the Italian state is that one. But again, Italy wouldn't really be formed for a good while after this. But yeah,
The French had the second advantage of a highly competent officer corps, including the legendary Marshal Michel Ney of the French cavalry. Russia was the second party.
So if we look, Berthier was the chief of staff for Napoleon. So basically, he did all of the admin shit, while Napoleon did all of the operational and strategic planning. Davout was one of his actual corps commanders, and so was Michael Ney, was also one of his corps commanders. And Michael Ney was also the spirit of the army, because this man was fucking fearless in everything he did. May not be he was not a good army commander. He was a decent corps commander if he was under Napoleon's direct supervision.
Party in this duel of juggernauts, with the core of the Tsarist army made up of peasant conscripts charged with serving for a full 25 years.
Yes, so Russia, historically, what they did for conscription was they just went around and were just like, hey, you're in the army now for 25 years. People would run away, people would try to maim themselves, there's a whole bunch of stuff. But basically, if you were poor in the serfdom of Russia, you're going to have a very bad time, especially if you get called up. Being called up for conscription was basically a death sentence, is what everyone saw, but more or less.
The average conscript was a man subjected to harsh conditions and harsher discipline, but he bore the travels with a sense of national pride and purpose. Of particular renown were the Cossacks, steppe raiders used as cavalry by the Russians. The Cossacks were given near total freedom of movement, operating as a force unto themselves to sow terror in the enemy ranks with their maneuvers.
And the thing is to remember that serfdom was still in effect by this time. Also, the Cossacks were technically freed, or free men. They were different from the conscripts. They liked war, which is a different concept that I'm not going to get into in modern view. But they liked war, they liked the raid, they liked everything about this, and they lived in the Don Cossack, obviously, in the steppe regions. And they were very effective cavalry for the Russian army. Actually, they were very effective for whoever they were serving.
The ebbs and flows of the campaign in Russia deserve their own video, but suffice to say that the armies that would meet at Borodino were shadows of their previously mentioned selves. 2 months of running battles, retreats, and skirmishes had taken their toll on both sides. The French had been reduced to half of their original force. When battle was finally met, 133,000 beaten and burned out men faced off against 125,000 Russians.
Now, you may be like, how is that possible? It's very simple. Disease. Disease was the main contributing factor for both of these. Disease won't go away from contributing to massive casualty losses until after World War One, because World War One, disease was still pretty bad. It was kind of almost the second leading cause. I'm pretty sure it was the first leading cause. In the Second World War, it was definitely gone by then because of penicillin and antibiotics. But during this time, immense damage was done just from disease alone. As you can see, like they went from 650,000 to 133,000. Napoleon lost his army in Russia, more or less.
Preparations for battle began on September 3rd, 1812. When the Russian commander, Mikhail Kutuzov, selected Borodino as the place where he would make his stand. Kutuzov was a fascinating character, a polyglot placed in overall command to balance out the twin generals of the Russian defense, the calculating Scottish import Michael Andreas Barclay and the passionate Pyotr Bagration.
Now, Bagration and, all of them have names that will later come up in World War II.
Kutuzov chose his field well. The village of Borodino was 70 miles or roughly 112 kilometers from Moscow, sitting along rivers and marshes nestled between the twin roads to the city. The Russians laid out a defense in 2 wings. The right wing...
Now, if you just look at this battle plan, just the terrain itself looks good.
The Russians...
Because they're deployed. So now they're deployed by... This is a tiny river, or tiny stream. I'm not really sure what it is. And then you have one major river here, and you're on 2 wings. So your enemy is going to have to either advance in withering fire to your front and have to advance over bad terrain, or do a flanking maneuver all the way around, in which time you're able to respond to that. So it's a very good defensive position that they've picked.
the right wing being situated along the Kolocha stream and backed up by 26 field guns, but cut off from the village of Borodino by the stream. The left wing was stretched out and vulnerable, arrayed along a line of marshes and the Semikovska stream, along with the namesake village of wooden houses with no defensive value.
So it looks like there's streams. Streams just make it more difficult for your enemy. They don't actually block it. And again, it depends there's a lot of factors, but one of the main ones is like how big your force is and where it is situated, where its strength is, where it is positioned on the line. All of that sort of stuff does come into play.
On September 5th, Napoleon's forces come across the Russian positions. The French quickly array themselves to strike on the weaker Russian left, focusing their initial efforts on a dug-in position called the Shevardino redoubt. The cavalry open the battle, engaging with the Russian horse, while French infantry march on the redoubt itself. The French cavalry send their counterparts to rout, as Napoleon's infantry engage in a point-blank musket duel with the Russians, who hold the redoubt by their fingernails as their flanks disintegrate. In a darkly comic twist, the commander of the Russian artillery had observed the opening moments of the battle and rode off to report to Bagration how well the position was holding. He now comes back to find the position crumbling, his guns perilously close to capture as Russian infantry abandon the redoubt. Nightfall.
So when he's talking about a redoubt, it's not that they're just in a fucking field like this. It means they're in very highly defensive positions, because this is basically just your forward position from the Russian line. If you take a look, so they're the forward position of the Russian line. So basically, they're just to stall them and inflict casualties on them, basically, and buy time in case I need to shuffle lines around. But this wasn't an easy position to take. Let's put it that way. If they have redoubts there, it's pretty hard.
How well the position was holding. He now comes back to find the position crumbling, his guns perilously close to capture as Russian infantry abandon the redoubt. Nightfall brings no respite, as the French continue their tug of war until the stroke of midnight, when orders from Kutuzov come to retreat. The French take the area, and the Russian commanders bicker in their tents. This initial engagement sees 18,000 Russians pitted against 25,000 French in a horrendous miscalculation. For now, an uneasy peace settles over Borodino. The Russians have no interest in sallying forth, while Napoleon feverishly finalizes his strategy, anticipating the arrival of his reserve artillery. The French emperor is presented with plans for a grand flanking maneuver, which he rejects outright, opting for a frontal assault. Kutuzov...
Because remember what I said, that you could technically flank that position if you went around the long way, which they did suggest, but a full frontal assault is what he's going to do.
Meanwhile, opts for a vague defensive plan, holding out for as long as possible and refusing to commit his reserves until the last possible moment.
That's also bad. Vague defense is not a very good idea. If you're going to sit there, you need to have a plan on how long you're sitting there and for what reason you're actually going to sit there.
The French construct bridges over the Kolocha above Borodino and array their guns to bombard the village. As the morning of the 7th dawns, Napoleon's officers read their men a proclamation from the emperor. Soldiers, here is the battle you have so much desired. The victory now depends on you. We have need of it. Victory will give us abundant supplies, good winter quarters, and a prompt return to our native land. Fight as you did at Austerlitz, Friedland, Vitebsk, and Smolensk, and posterity will remember with pride your conduct on this great day. May it be said of each of us, he fought in that great battle under the walls of Moscow. The French commit 85,000 men to Napoleon's grand assault, who will throw themselves at the Russians along a 1.5-mile or roughly 2-kilometer front stretching from a redoubt in the north commanded by Russian General Nikolai Raevsky to fetid marshland in the south. In the far south, a Polish contingent marches up the old Smolensk road to outflank the Russians. At 6 a.m. precisely, the French guns open up, hammering on the Russian soldiers in Borodino. Barclay orders his men to abandon the village and burn the Borodino bridge, but the Russians are already engaged. In 15 minutes, they lose over half their numbers, but succeed in burning the bridge as ordered. The French plant artillery on their side of the river in response, bringing the Russians' own cannon and Raevski's redoubt quite literally under the gun.
So again, the whole reason for taking this village is to bring up your artillery to bombard the redoubt. The redoubt is, again, a very highly defended... It's basically just a fucking trench system. More or less what I can give you on that. But they're going to burn the bridges to slow the enemy down, but they're going to bring up their artillery to shell the shit out of them.
A half hour later, Russians under Bagration face a French assault on their earthworks, or flèches, with Napoleon's forces marching through devastating canister shot and ambushes by Russian Jaegers as they make for the earthworks. The French are bloodied by their advance and driven off by the Russians, who hold their fortifications. At the same time, the Poles on the Smolensk road assault the village of Utitsa, which includes a hill with a commanding view of the battlefield. The Russians fight hard to hold the high ground, burning Utitsa itself in their bid to deny Napoleon. As the Poles continue to push on the village, French forces enter the nearby woods to clear the troublesome Jaegers.
So Jaegers are their hunter, or translates to hunters, and they're the guys actually armed with black powder rifles, which shoot a little bit farther but take a longer to reload, so they are used as skirmish.
Both sides send reinforcements into the fights, and the struggle for Bagration's flèches is particularly fierce. A renewed French assault outpaces Russian reinforcements, and Bagration himself is injured. Though he successfully withdraws and survives, a rumor burns through his lines that the passionate commander is dead, critically wounding Russian morale. Bagration is carried to a medical tent where he begins issuing orders. At 9:30 a.m., Raevski's redoubt sees its first attack. The French advance slowly on the fortification, unaware that many of its defenders have been siphoned off to other areas. The redoubt is a cramped affair, too small to hold any infantry, so the crews of their 18 guns inside are expected to both serve their pieces and defend the parapet.
Now, I know some of these uniforms. I'm pretty sure there's a lot of things that go along with Napoleonic uniforms, and I'm obviously not an expert on this, but usually red fez, red braid on their helmets usually means your artillery, the white usually means your infantry.
The Russian infantry mass outside the walls, while the cavalry stand on to the left rear of the fortification, and are severely bloodied by the French opening bombardment. Raevski observes the battle from the parapet, and sees an initial French assault repulsed by his infantry, but the general's celebration is short-lived, as the smoke from his weapons create an ad hoc smoke screen that the French use to mask a second push. Raevski, ignorant of the French advance, receives word that Bagration has been injured and has requested he change positions. As he takes in this new order, Raevski is suddenly forced to retreat before a wave of Napoleon's grenadiers, bayonets fixed and murder in their eyes. The French sweep Raevski and his men from the redoubt. While the fighting rages at Bagration's flèches...
So grenadiers, usually every regiment had a company of grenadiers, which are basically the tallest, most aggressive people. Now, there are units of grenadiers, which Napoleon did use. Technically, the young, middle, and old guard are also technically grenadiers. So.
And Raevski's redoubt, Napoleon commands an assault on the Russians' center-left with a majority cavalry force. The French riders blunder into the Russian lines and are at risk of being swamped by their Tsarist counterparts until a lancer unit makes a spectacular counter, sending the Russian horse scattering. The Russian infantry is made of sterner stuff and forms squares that catch the seemingly ascendant French cavalry in a withering crossfire. The Russians trip up the French so badly that their infantry are able to launch a bayonet charge against cavalry. Napoleon fails to commit his reserves into the fight, continually insisting he lacks sufficient intelligence to do so. Though it is reported the emperor is exhausted and utterly sleep-deprived, which may explain his bizarre decision here. Nevertheless, the Russians stand like stone in the face of Napoleon's attack and hold their positions for a full 2 hours.
So Napoleon does not like deploying his reserves, because what is in his reserves are basically his old guard. Now, they're a very experienced unit, and they'll probably beat the shit out of anybody they fight, but he never really deployed them. He usually deployed the young and middle guard. By this time, I think they are formed, the young and middle guard, in 1812. But he very rarely deployed his actual reserve. Again, he has different reserves, right? His old guard is part of his reserve, and then he has other reserves. Reserve is just meaning troops in the back that can be sent forward.
As the battle rages, Cossacks suddenly appear in a flanking maneuver on the French line. Barclay rides to assume command from Bagration and is stopped by the spectacle of the fight over Raevski's redoubt. Smoke and flame prevent the Scot from seeing anything, and he sends a subordinate to investigate, who finds the defense in collapse and the redoubt in French hands. But the French are counterattacked from 4 directions simultaneously, and in 10 minutes their gains are entirely reversed, the Cossacks' presence deterring a French counterattack and buying the Russians critical time. It is afternoon in Borodino, Raevski's redoubt has been recaptured, the Poles at Utitsa are finally and definitively repulsed, and the fortunes of battle seem to be shifting against Napoleon. It is now critical that the French retake Raevski's redoubt, and after hours' delay, thanks to the Cossacks and Russian artillery, Napoleon's men march once more. Barclay demurs on reinforcing the position, leaving whoever is defending the redoubt to their own devices. The redoubt is assaulted at 3 p.m., led by the French horse, who fly in to engage the defenders hand-to-hand with the French infantry close behind. The Russian infantry draw themselves up on elevated ground behind the redoubt, with conspicuous gaps in their line. The French cavalry leave the redoubt to engage the Russians, riding straight through the gaps in their own line, where they are set on by Barclay's cavalry in a bitter melee. On the whole, the Russians have steadily been pushed back despite winning tactical victories, and the defenders of Utitsa find themselves in a salient, which they pull out of in the late afternoon.
So what he's talking about here is a salient. You just said it, salient. So a salient means like this entire line has been pushed back, and these guys are exposed. They can be flanked and encircled, basically.
In a salient, which they pull out of in the late afternoon, leaving the village to finally fall to the Poles. Barclay sends a staff officer to Kutuzov to ask for reinforcements, and a chance to salvage something from this back and forth. Barclay's rider finds Kutuzov far off from the fighting, surrounded by an entourage of young and thoroughly debauched officers. Kutuzov is indignant at a report of Napoleon's progress, declaring that the messenger was clearly a drunkard who had not seen the real battle.
Meanwhile, he's actually wounded, yeah.
We have victoriously repulsed the French attackers along the whole length of our front, and tomorrow I shall place myself at the head of the army and drive the enemy without more ado from the holy soil of Russia. Despite his outright delusional statements, Kutuzov orders Barclay to withdraw to better ground, convinced that at a minimum, the French have been desperately bloodied and he can marshal a grand counterattack the next day. Barclay knows this to be a folly and orders a general retreat. It is now 6 p.m. in Borodino, and the battle is finally over.
Yeah, again, they've lost all of their ground that they had. So, I mean, everything that they were defending to this point, they've lost their villages, they've lost their redoubts. There is no point in staying here, so a general retreat is called for at this point.
Kutuzov declared himself the winner of a great victory and wrote a letter to Tsar Alexander informing him. The vainglorious general received 100,000 rubles and promotion to field marshal, all at the cost of 38 to 44,000 dead and wounded, which equates to roughly 34% of the troops committed to the fight. Kutuzov was not far off with his uninformed estimation of the French condition. Napoleon's forces were bloodied, with 30,000 killed and wounded, but Borodino allowed Napoleon to march on and occupy Moscow, a feat which logically should have led to the Tsar's surrender, a surrender which did not come. The Grande Armée emerged from Borodino a husk, exhausted and wretched, so they wintered in Moscow before their disastrous withdrawal back to warmer climes, marching not from the scene of a great victory, but to the beginning of Napoleon's end.
Yeah, so Borodino was the one battle they would fight before Moscow. Then Napoleon would basically take Moscow with no resistance, except the Russians would burn it to the ground. They would get there, it's been burned to the ground. They can't stay there, so therefore they have to retreat in the winter back, and that's a whole other story. So I hope you guys liked this video. Leave me a like if you did. Write something down in the comment section if you want to. Otherwise, I shall see you people next time.